Thank you. My name's Chris Marshall. I lead, as you mentioned, IDC's research on industries. But perhaps more importantly, from the context of this session, I'm also very much an advocate of sustainability, and I lead our sustainability research in the region. My background, I'll be quite honest, I'm not a sustainability expert. I come from a world of analytics, data, and AI, and that's kind of how I'm approaching this. But I think it's such an important topic that we've all got to sort of put our hands to the wheel and use our skills as best we can to support sustainability. And I would argue one of the problems that sustainability has had is that it's such a diverse topic, and it struggles because it lacks that unifying core. If there's a unifying core, I would argue it's probably around data and analytics. And I would argue that this is actually both a challenge and an opportunity for IT vendors in the region. And I'll talk more about how we see that playing out moving forward. So what I want to talk about today is IDC's predictions, really, around sustainability and what the market is telling us about what's important and what's perhaps not quite so important moving forward. Sustainability is no surprise. It's probably one of the most widely talked about topics at the moment. Clearly, the UN Development Goals have outlined sustainability as one of their top priorities across the board. And a variety of countries across the board have sort of said, we're going to make being carbon neutral in the wake of possible global warming an absolute priority, and they talk about 2030, 2040, 2070 in some cases. So these topics, obviously, hugely important, not just from almost a trivial perspective of corporate profits, but more importantly than that, human survival on the planet. So it really is that they're the stakes we're playing for. And not surprisingly, when we look at this from a more corporate perspective, companies tell us, ESG really is important. 74% tell us that ESG factors are important, very important, for the enterprise value of their companies. They also see, and this is slightly more surprising and more interesting, 95% tell us that sustainability is going to drive the buying habits, particularly of millennials and Gen Z customers. And of course that has all sorts of knock-on effects to the products and services that those companies deliver. From a more of a technology perspective, this survey we did, and incidentally this was about 1,000 CEOs or senior executives across the world, and we actually drilled it down by region as well. Something like 43% said that sustainability was increasingly a major concern for their buying decisions. Of course, this is going to be part of it's already essentially part of every RFP. A little page at the back where you talk about green practices. Understanding how ESG is going to play a role in technology companies, in the technologies they provide, the services they provide, how those technologies are implemented in use cases, how companies deploy those technologies in the broader business context is going to be a future topic for not just for this year, but for the next decade or two, I suspect. A bit more close to home for me, at least, is the fact that more than half of the companies we surveyed, the leaders, said that data and analytics was a primary use case for any sustainability initiatives that they have. And this may be an early stage kind of requirement of sustainability. You've got to gather the data before you even know where you can cut your emissions, for example, in the case of carbon footprint. But still, it also points out the opportunity in the marketplace. In fact, I would argue, as one of the themes of today's talk, is that sustainability is not an alternative to digital transformation. It's very much part and parcel of digital transformation. They're not choices. They're all at once. They're both, right? So linking these pieces together is very challenging for a variety of different reasons. Data, analytics, leadership, commitment, and even political concerns. And there's all sorts of debates, which I won't get into here, about the national priorities associated with sustainability. But we're all human beings, and we all live on the same planet, and ultimately we all care about the fate of the world we live in. So I think this is a topic that we've really got to take very, very seriously. And when we actually drill down for a moment and ask, why are companies starting to make investments in sustainable technology, why are they buying sustainable products from more sustainably oriented companies, they tend to tell us things like this. They tend to say, well, it's defensive. Maybe some of them say, well, my board wants to make sure that I've got clean hands and I'm doing the right thing. Maybe it's maybe there's some activist shareholders that are saying, you know, you've got to do this, otherwise we're going to get very upset. Or maybe it's your bank saying, you know, we'll give you a discount if you have with a green lending policy or something like that. So clearly those are factors that are influencing the move towards sustainability. But there's also mandatory requirements. Usually they're more policy than they are mandatory at the moment, but that of course depends on particular countries. And one of the challenges we have in this space is just the manifold different standards that different countries are employing and imposing on companies as they operate in different parts of the world, with different expectations of what sustainability really means. A few will say things like, you know, 11% will say things like, well, it just feels like the right thing to do. And in many ways, that may sound the lamest of the possible excuses, but it's perhaps the most important. I think it is the right thing to do. If you take this from an ethical perspective, you've really got no choice but to do this, it seems to me. A lot, honestly, do talk about this in terms of improving the brand image or the reputation of the company. And of course, the danger with that, there's nothing wrong with that in itself, but the danger is that it becomes a greenwashing story. And ultimately, in a sort of age of social media, greenwashing is really a bad idea. You don't want to do that, because if you get caught, you will really get hurt badly. And this is the sort of thing that actually does lead to companies losing their CEOs. And again, if you want to define a non-career advancing move, that's probably not a good thing to do. A bit more positively, I treat this as a hope for the future. You know, a lot of companies are starting to look at sustainability. 18% look at it in terms of how do I incorporate business value into my business processes by incorporating sustainability. This is usually in the form of things like energy efficiency. That's the most obvious way that they do this, right? They say, like, I can cut carbon emissions by decreasing my perhaps on-prem data center, or perhaps by digitizing some process so it doesn't require so much manual intervention. I would also argue that things like hybrid work are another important way of improving sustainability, which I don't think people have really emphasized anywhere near enough. Hybrid work by its very nature, you know, I've just come from Bangalore. I don't know how long it takes to get on the road to the office in Bangalore. But clearly that's true across the world. It's true in my own country, in the UK. People spend a lot of time commuting. The less time they spend commuting, the less time they're in their cars, and the less time they're racking up their carbon footprint. So I think hybrid working is part of this story. The future of work is very much part of this story. And this is something we're very much researching at IDC. So they're obviously looking at sustainable technologies as a way to sort of improve their ESG performance broadly, but sustainability in particular. And while I would argue that ESG was certainly a hot topic in Europe and the US, I think in Asia the story is becoming much more of a sustainability story on its own. But I think it's important that we separate that, because frankly, ESG tends to have been a little bit hijacked, honestly, in terms of the social aspects of it. And I'm not saying that they are bad or good, but they're certainly somewhat culture specific, and I don't want to sort of impose any sort of hegemony on what one nation or one culture should do. It's not appropriate. But I think sustainability is a cause that we can all rally around, and I think that's the right way to sort of tell this story and understand this story. But what I think it does mean is that, you know, we are moving quickly towards a more sustainable world. But there's things that are getting in the way, right? The obvious one, and we actually asked our leaders across the board what were the operational challenges that they were facing in terms of their sustainable goals. First and foremost, and goes back to my earlier point, data. It's spread all over the place. Sustainable, anytime you've got a physical asset that's moving around or doing something, you've got a carbon footprint. And if you take it very narrowly, thinking about your carbon footprint, understanding the carbon footprint really means understanding the movement and the use of physical assets within the enterprise and the wider ecosystem that supports that enterprise. How do I capture data about that? It is jolly difficult. It is very difficult. More importantly, perhaps, not just how do I capture data about the utilization of different assets and how they're used and modified and changed, but also how does that convert into carbon footprint? The models that go from, you know, simple statement of, you know, I drove the car 9 miles down the road, and incorporating that into a carbon footprint analysis is not trivial at all. And there's a lot of debate about the right way to do it. And inevitably, these are just models. They are approximate. They're rough and ready. They're often, frankly, spreadsheet based and not really very amenable to audit. So people don't even trust the results of these models. This is changing slowly, and I think there's now becoming a discipline around sustainability measurement and monitoring and management that we didn't have before. But again, it's about this process of validating and verifying the accuracy of the numbers we produce from our models. And this is starting to appear in the form of sort of sustainability audits and things like this. But that was the second hot or top operational challenge that companies were facing. Another one is actually the skills, and again, we've been trying to, at IDC, we've been trying to hire a number of sustainability analysts for something like 6 or 7 months now. We've struggled because it's just very difficult to get people on the ground with this sort of expertise. And I'm sure any of you who've tried to hire a chief sustainability officer know exactly what that challenge is. What tends to happen is it tends to be hired from within, organically. Somebody from perhaps marketing, operations, takes on the role partly because of their personal commitment to the topic. And I think that's great, but it does mean that we lack a certain depth of expertise when it comes to things like green data centers or recycling or cradle to cradle or all these different things. With those challenges in mind, customers are then saying, well, what are the things that providers need to help us with? Well, usually what they're saying is that they're looking for end-to-end solutions. Again, these are opportunities in one sense for vendors in the marketplace. And they usually say end-to-end solution capabilities, not just a reporting platform, but actually something that goes beyond pure reporting. This is challenging, quite frankly. Most of the companies that we talk to are very much at the reporting stage. But being able to know, okay, you've told me that the carbon footprint is X for this particular sub-business process or this supplier. So what? What do I do about it? How do I convert that into operational levers I can pull that change things? And again, this hints at some of the challenges that companies have in converting those metrics into real things they can do about, something about. So another thing that hasn't helped, frankly, is the variety of different reporting standards that we have for sustainability. And frankly, the changing environment that we face. So all of these are themes that our clients are telling us are important in the marketplace today for sustainability. But clearly, new use cases are starting to unfold on the back of these challenges. And again, this is very vertical because, frankly, a lot of the sustainable use cases are very vertical. They're very driven by a particular industry domain. So, for example, we see things like digital twins, digital engineering, operational technology, OT, IT integration, IoT, customer analytics, HR systems for diversity and inclusion, all these sort of things. Collaboration tools in some cases are being considered as part of a sustainability story, a larger sustainability story. But perhaps the most important, it seems to be, is the idea of ecosystems. And by ecosystem, I don't mean biological ecosystems, I mean industry ecosystems. Understanding exactly where our partners, our customers, our suppliers, the whole supply chain, if you like, are in terms of their sustainability journey. And making sure that they all have the data and the analytics they need to support everybody on the entire ecosystem journey. And I think if there's one message that I take away from COVID is this idea that, it really does take, I think it was Hillary Clinton who said, it takes a village. And I think that's right. It takes a village to raise a child. And in the same way, it takes a village to raise a company. It takes an ecosystem to raise a company, if you will. And the technologies that support the ecosystem, that monitor the ecosystem, are almost a requirement now. Again, I mentioned a little earlier, the Scope 3 emissions requirement, particularly from the EU, that is really forcing certainly manufacturing organizations to think hard about how do different parts of the supply chain contribute to the larger carbon footprint that the company ultimately consumes. And I think you should always be thinking about this not simply in terms of, not in terms of measurement or monitoring, but rather in terms of operational improvement. I think it's certainly true that many technologies have got a great track record. I'm sure there's many of you from cloud, some of the big hyperscalers, and they'll tell a very good story, honestly, about sustainability and green technology, particularly in things like green data centers, the obvious case in point. But it slightly begs the question, because of course, if those green data centers are using electricity from coal-fired power stations, not quite so good after all, right? So the problem that we face when thinking about ecosystems is that you never know quite when to stop. And at what point is it not my problem, or not in my backyard kind of problem? But I think that is going to be slowly sorted out as we start to improve our data, our analytics, and we start to standardize and institutionalize those data and metrics across the board. This is an opportunity also for things like AI, because this is all about learning. This is all about figuring out, okay, how do we optimize, for example, the use of how we move cranes about on a portside dock. You know, it takes a lot of power, electricity, and of course, you know, very often you find that once you move them, you have to move them somewhere else again. So all of these things are really can be supported by near continuous or real-time analytics, streaming data platforms, all of which tell us something about how to optimize our use of assets across the board. Overlaying all of this is trust. You know, if I don't trust the numbers I get, there's no way I'm going to be able to report them. There's always the risk that somebody will pull the rug from under me and say, you know, you guys are greenwashing. You know, there's no way this is going to be hold true because I don't believe your numbers. So I think these are real themes. These technology use cases are starting to become hot topics for us at IDC. And I suspect they're going to be hot topics for all vendors across the board. And even if you haven't got a sustainable story, you're going to have to start to develop one very soon. So the sort of applications and technologies that people are starting to use to deploy sustainability, if you like, or make sustainability happen, usually boil down, as I mentioned, first and foremost to dashboards, data analytics tools, but also things like MESs, manufacturing execution systems, product lifecycle management systems, retail execution systems, so sort of ERP level kind of capabilities. Also asset management, and this is perhaps the least popular topic, but I think it's so important. Asset management in terms of things like building maintenance, building management, fleet management. These are all ways to significantly improve the sustainability of large physical organizations, if you like. All too often, I'm afraid, however, that it tends to be relegated or delegated to the humble spreadsheet to manage and monitor this data. And of course, that's no way is that going to be auditable or sustainable in the longer term. So new technologies that are starting to happen that our people are getting excited about, and the most obvious one again is cloud. Cloud is clearly pushing everybody to think virtually, and of course that helps sustainability because you get, first of all, you get a consolidation of load onto one place, and that means that, you know, less utilized on-prem data centers are to some extent pushed aside, and we don't need them anymore, and they don't need to consume the electricity anymore. And that means, you know, the hyperscalers presumably can focus on greener sources of energy to support them, and they tend to make them very, very efficient as well. So again, a win-win really all round. And they can use technologies in clever ways to, for example, to recycle water cooling in water-cooled data centers and the like. And all of this is good, no question about it. But another thing that is very important is things like 5G and IoT. 5G technologies are really enabling a new world of digital engineering in terms of the ability to develop real-time monitoring of assets as they move over time. And you see this in everything from trucks to cars to cranes to all sorts of different tools that have now got 5G capabilities associated with them. Anything that's moving. And of course, when you've got 5G, then you start to talk about geolocation. Geolocation technologies telling you exactly where you are and pinpointing you precisely as to the most optimal movement from here to there. That's another way to actually improve the efficiency and the overall sustainability of your particular asset portfolio. So again, I'm not going to get too much into the details of the data points here, but I think what is important, and we're seeing this here in India. In India, you're seeing specifically the focus tends to be on reduced waste and cost reduction, quite frankly. And nothing wrong with that. I mean, if the world did that, we'd all be in a much better place, no doubt. But I think more important, in the longer term, is probably to leverage, if you like, the capitalist system, the market system that we all tend to live in, to jumpstart the process. And the only way you can do that is if you actually actively develop new revenue streams. Because then you're going to be able to compete and come up with the best possible solution to whatever the problem you're trying to solve from a sustainability perspective. Not far behind, though, is this brand reputational issue. And this is a real concern. And I would argue a large part of the drive for sustainability still is fear, frankly, about brand reputation and making sure that brand reputation is safeguarded and ultimately not threatened. When we look at, we actually see quite a wide range of different technology investments going on here in India. And I'll just point to a few of them. Health and safety, 1 out of 5 companies in, I think these are manufacturing companies, in India are actually deploying EHS kind of tools and systems. So again, another opportunity for the technology vendors to actually take a lead. One thing that's a little surprising for me is the next one, the green data centers. 1 in 10, which seems remarkably low to me. And again, that may reflect the weakness of the sustainability story. And that is, it tends to be very good for the larger companies, but not so good for the smaller ones, because they just see it as a cost, quite frankly. And one of the things that I think as a society we've got to figure out how to solve is how do we get the smaller companies to get on board with sustainability. And that's almost a cultural issue, maybe that's a government issue, and obviously that depends by states and all sorts of things like that. But it's a problem we have to solve. I mean, in most of the economies in Asia, I don't know what it is in India, but certainly in large parts of Asia, it's 70–80% of the entire GDP is driven by smaller companies. And of course, if that's the case, then you can probably guess that at least 60% of the carbon footprint is probably driven by those, maybe more, I suspect. So, a lot of things happening, but a lot of change as well that's happening as well. So I think that's very interesting. And change is kind of the order of the day, because there's lots of government policies and regulations that are happening right now. The financial institutions themselves are starting to put pressure on their customers, their borrowers, and say, you've got to get your act together. If you don't get your act together, we'll put you in the bad bucket, the bad lending bucket, as opposed to the green lending bucket, and we'll penalise you for that. And of course, a few basis points here or there makes a big difference. And that's true also on the asset management side, the investor side. Investors are starting to insist that the companies they invest in are ethical, green, sustainable, what have you. So those things are happening right now, and in some cases, I think obviously Europe is driving a lot of this. But make no mistake, what happens in Europe or the US will go through Asia very fast. It's already happening. Australia, Singapore, India too. They're all making efforts in this direction. So it's a matter of when rather than whether. In fact, when we look at it from more of a regional perspective, we sort of see the pace setters. And again, I think of Australia, Singapore, maybe South Korea and Japan. Japan certainly are really the leaders in the space. There's no question about it. I think the emerging leaders behind them, frankly, are places like India. China, obviously, simply by its very scale, can do things that only India and China in the region have any hope to be able to do, realistically. Others that are slightly sitting on the fence but are starting to move in the right direction are Vietnam and Malaysia. A lot of other countries are still very much waiting and seeing and maybe hoping it goes away or somebody gives them a budget to do it. Or maybe they feel there's just other priorities on the table they have to worry about. But again, this is not an ethical kind of condemnation, it's just a fact of life. This is just the way the market is at the moment. And again, consistently you see that there's a cost optimization or cost minimization story in the background, no matter who you are and how you're doing it. So, predictions. I did actually start this with talking about predictions, and I just want to flag some interesting predictions for the next few years. I think in the next year we should see that ESG performance will become a standard measure that we use to evaluate the risk of any counterparty. And again, many companies are already doing this. They evaluate the sustainability of their counterparties, their investors, their partners, their suppliers. And that's going to be a thing that's just going to happen, almost already there in my view. 2024, slightly more challenging. Half the AP companies, Asia Pac companies, will capture and report carbon data using quantifiable metrics. So again, they may not be very good metrics, that's not the issue entirely, but they will try to at least capture those metrics. And they'll be looking at building or developing data platforms to support that. Say ESG requires a huge amount of data to be effective. And if people start reporting on this, as they will have to, and you're already seeing a lot of the financial reporting boards across the region sort of insisting that there's some sort of ESG or sustainability kind of component in their financial reporting. That means they have to be audited. And of course, once you start auditing people for things, then you have to take it very seriously. 2025, we're looking at roughly anybody using a data center will insist that we understand exactly how much, what their carbon footprint is, how much real estate they're using, how much water they're using, how efficient those data centers are, the extent of recyclability they're employing in their organization, and so on and so forth. So this is something that's going to happen in a matter of a couple of years, I suspect. This is a bit more provocative, and again, it's maybe an even bigger opportunity in many ways. But I think that ESG people will realize quite quickly this is not my core business. I can't do this very well because it's such a standard set of skills that it's quite common across very different industries. So I think a lot of, at least a third, I think this is actually an understatement, a third of ESG services, sustainability services, are going to involve some sort of managed service component. And I think that's going to be bigger than that, actually. We'll see. By 2026, we think that ESG performance and circularity, asset circularity, will be priority factors in tech procurement. And I think we've already started to see it in the consumer electronics space. People are now starting to talk to things like the right to repair, in terms of their consumer electronics. So I think that's something that's going to start to become relevant across the entire B2B space as well. So I think that's only a good thing. The move towards centralized sustainable monitoring is, again, inevitable. Once you start having a CSO, you have a centralized data platform, this is going to be something that we have to do. More controversial, this last one, and I'm going to put this out there and you can disagree with it if you like, but this is very much driven out of Europe, that social use cases will come on the back of a lot of sustainability initiatives. And again, we can debate that, but in Europe it's already happening. It's very difficult to separate fairness, equity, things like that, from diversity, from the discussion of sustainability. In Asia, it's a more complicated, politically sensitive topic, and I understand that. But it's something that very often comes from the back of sustainability discussions. Understandably, because we're starting to think about the broader ecosystem, we almost, by the very nature, to think about things like equity and fairness and inclusion. And banks have long worried about banking inclusion in their broader markets. And again, this hints at this idea that we need to think about ecosystems, not just our own individual, our little pocket in our organizations. So where do we go from here? Well, I would argue there's four things that are probably important, key here. Focus on technologies and services that really operationalize sustainability and ESG. How do we make it real? There's lots of opportunities, business opportunities that are really coming from scratch. And most of them depend on having the data. So I would argue, a lot of the cloud services, the managed service companies, have got a wonderful opportunity here to make some money because they've got data already. They can actually build it if they know how to use it. So I think that's an interesting topic. I think there's going to be a big focus on partnerships for sustainability. We're already talking about marketplaces. We're talking about things like blockchain technologies to share data across different parties, particularly in the supply chain. How do I share my carbon footprint without somehow putting myself at a disadvantage relative to you? Standardization, compliance, alignment. Anything to do with politics, I'm always nervous of because it just takes too long. What they always say about politics is like making sausages. You don't really want to see either being done. It's not a very pleasant experience. So difficult, long term, will take time, no question about it. Will we be in time for the UN Development Goals? I have my own views. I'm sure you're on that. Proof of value. Ultimately, this data means absolutely nothing unless it can be proven to be valid. And the metrics we report have got to be credible. Unless they are, evidenced and justified, it's going to be very difficult to justify the investment to improve the underlying operations that led to those metrics in the first place. So until we sort of loop back to what were the operations that were causing those say, carbon footprint metrics to go out of kilter, it's going to be very difficult for us to tell a coherent learning story. And this really goes back to this discussion of the digital transformation. Because that's why I think sustainability and digital transformation are fundamentally tightly linked. Because they're both ultimately about learning. They're learning to make the most of physical resources. But we do it using data embedded in every single aspect of the process, every asset, every physical movement of a thing or person or whatever it is. We're understanding how that contributes to what today we've considered a free resource, namely, in this case, the carbon footprint of the planet. So this is the future, it seems to me, and I'm happy to open to some questions. But hopefully I've given you some ideas as to how we're thinking about it, and we're starting to gather much more data about what are the hot topics in the marketplace, and how this plays out in each industry. And I would just add that this is very much an industry story, in my view. It's very difficult to talk about sustainability across the board. You've got to talk about sustainability for airlines. You've got to talk about sustainability for data centers. You've got to talk about sustainability for hospitals, whatever it is. So with that, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the session. I hope you found it interesting. And hopefully I gave you a little bit of food for thought. And I don't know if we've got time for questions. I'm not sure if we do. Maybe we do. I'm sure we can take a question. Please.
Thank you, Krish. It was a good session. I just wanted to know, because in this conference it's more not the teams which are driving sustainability internally, but their customer-facing teams. So you talked about the enterprise data management platforms as a priority for 2024 in Asia. So is there an opportunity, because even now that piece is broken, it's not a really true enterprise data management platform for monitoring, reporting to regulators, to your stakeholders. So is there an opportunity for the Indian tech industry, including startups, to build a really de novo enterprise data management platform only for ESG?
I think there is. But I suspect you're going to have to do it based on a corpus of data that you can build upon. I think, gathering data is never an end in itself. It's always for a particular purpose. And the purpose has got to be about modeling whatever the carbon footprint is for a particular industry. So I think you've got to do it vertically. I think you've got to do it one step at a time. It's got to be based on a lot of data. I mean, honestly, the modeling is pretty straightforward. It's not particularly complicated. Yeah, I mean, the models are usually fairly trivial from an analytic perspective. The problem is the quality of the data is not very good. And, you're having to inevitably, you have to make some big assumptions. And those assumptions are not always easy to justify. You can improve those by making more complex models, but then, of course, is the trade-off worth it? It's not always clear. Just like, it reminds me a little bit, I used to be in the financial service space, and I used to do a lot of work on risk management, which is a related topic in many cases. And risk management, certainly in the 80s and 90s, was very like that. It was very slightly ad hoc, not very mathematical, not very quantitative. We talk about high, medium, low risks and things like that. We wouldn't quantify it. And I think the same is happening in sustainability. So in one sense, sustainability is like financial risk management was back in 1980 or something. Yeah, but that'll change. I mean, again, now that's a very different industry. So these things do evolve. And I think it's important to be optimistic. I don't think you should view this as a doom and gloom thing, because take the obvious case, a remarkable case. We've all forgotten the ozone hole, right? Ozone layer. We all were worried about the ozone layer, 10 years ago, I guess. And remarkably, human beings, I'm always shocked how well this worked. I mean, we got together, we instigated some, rules and regulations about companies that were using fluorocarbons in fridges and things like that. And we set a rule, and they stopped doing that. And guess what? It worked. The ozone hole improved. And that should give us hope. It's difficult. There's no point in denying. It's very difficult. especially when you take the broader set of, I mean, if you look at the UN development goals, it's like 20 something of them, and they're very difficult. But the odd thing, and there's a wonderful book about this, which I recommend, which is all about the future, in many ways, is getting better. I mean, it's very easy. We all read too much, watch too much CNN, and BBC, and whatever, and the Indian equivalents, I'm sure. But it's very easy to be pessimistic. And I think we've got to fight that, because if you do that, you just give up. And that's not viable. It's not helpful to anyone. You have to be an optimist to act. Unless you're an optimist, you just give up. So I think we've got to keep a very positive attitude. And one way to do that is to think about this as an opportunity, not a threat, not a problem, not a risk, if you like. So I'm very bullish on that. And I think, you know, especially if we leverage or integrate digital transformation with this sustainability story, because I think they are closely interlinked. Unless we can do that, it's going to be difficult. Please.
Chris Surya from TCS. So my question was around ecosystems. So my question was around ecosystems. So I was wondering what kind of incentives are there for the participants to get into this ecosystem. That is first part of the question. The second part is, do you see, because trust becomes an issue there, and what role does blockchain play there?
True.
So must have or good to have?
That's a good question. What got us into this mess is the tragedy of the commons, right? Ultimately, is the fact that we had a shared resource that frankly, we didn't really look after very well. And ecosystems, in my view, are the only way we can actually start to talk about this. The problem is the culture, I suppose, that we all operate in, sort of capitalist economies. We tend to think very much, my company is my company, your company is a competitor or a threat or customer or whatever. One thing I find fascinating is when I come to India and I talk to the Tatars, and the Wipros and all the rest, and they always emphasize this idea of community. And I think that's fantastic, personally. I wish I could translate that into my own country. It's not always easy. But I think that story is exactly the right story, because as you've seen, it does take this village to make it work. Blockchain, I'm a little bit more doubtful. I mean, I think the glory days of blockchain, the problem with blockchain is that ultimately there's a lot of incentives not to do it, and it tends to fall apart. So one thing we've seen successes with blockchain tend to be where you've got one large company that can impose its will on its supplier, the broader supply chain, and then it works very well, because if you're Maersk, you can say all my suppliers have got to do this, this, and this. If I'm Caterpillar, I can say anybody giving me stuff has got to enter their data into this platform. Gets a bit more complicated in more less homogeneous worlds, if you like, and that's the real challenge. And again, it's the tragedy of the commons problem. It's how do we trust each other to share? I hope, I may be wrong, maybe naive, that when we have, there's nothing like a crime. I mean, the great human beings are fantastic. I mean, they are quite fantastic, really. They are so tough. They are so resilient. And I think what Winston Churchill said about America, actually. America will do the right thing after it's done all the wrong things first. Which I think is a bit true of human beings in general, really. I mean, I think we're very good eventually. But it takes a long time for us to figure it out. And we may do a lot of mess in the process. But I think you have to have that optimistic view, otherwise you're just going to give up. So that's I know that's not really a blockchain answer, is it? Really? No.
As good as it answers anything.
Exactly. I suppose that's right.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
Just moving aside from technology, are you seeing any significant work happening in the field of material sciences?
Oh, goodness. Material sciences. Yeah, I think recycling is the obvious thing, right? Recycling and cradle manufacturing. That's a hugely hot topic. I mean, we're starting to see a revolution in how plastics are being developed in terms of, reuse. I mean, it's not just regulatory driven, although that's a big part of it. But my sense, and I'm not an expert, is that they're actually doing fantastic things in terms of biodegradable plastics and stuff like that. So yeah, I would assume that's got to be a very big topic. One of the challenges with sustainability is it's a mile wide, right? And it's so easy because you just cannot possibly keep in touch with all the different things that are going on. And, we all struggle with that. But I'm sure that is true. So the cradle to cradle is again one of those topics that really should have been here 20 years ago. It's not a new idea. It's just common sense, really. And you're seeing it with things like PLM, etc. So I think every manufacturer of a physical asset is thinking about this, whether it's a piece of plastic, cardboard, computer, whatever it is. How do we design for recycling? And again, that is all opening up completely new business models. I mean, Amory Lovins talks about this a lot. He talks about how do you, instead of delivering assets like a laptop, why don't you deliver services and have those services be paid for on a subscription basis? So you talk about cooling or heating. I don't want a heater. I don't want a fridge. I just want cooling services. Or I want computing services, or whatever it is. And if you take that seriously, that one idea is a revolution. That really is a revolution if you think about it in those terms. And again, that's completely aligned with a digital transformation story. Yeah, completely aligned. The idea of service offerings is what you really want. You don't want physical things. Again, maybe human beings haven't got to that level of evolution where we're able to sort of say, I want my MTV, I want my TV screen, it's my TV screen. Whereas really what you probably want is video services or something like that. So, anyway, the long answer to a good question. Any other? I know we're probably a bit late. But.
Yeah, so just in the interest of time, so probably we'll take just another question.
Sure, thanks. Me and my colleagues, we have been thinking long and hard about this whole sustainability challenge that the industry is facing, and we believe it's extremely complex, vertically, horizontally, in every
direction you can possibly go.
Right? And finding answer to that is going to be extremely challenging for, I think, all of us together. Because each function, the way they procure, the way they consume, the way they spend or the kind of services they provide, within each organization is different. Absolutely. So measuring each of that, measuring the data, what you said, is definitely a start. But what next is the challenge. How to implement those course correction actions, how to go beyond that are the next further challenges.
Definitely. I mean, it means nothing if it's just a reporting exercise.
Exactly. So my question to you is, from industry perspective, we are seeing a lot of organizations coming up with consulting services around sustainability. But I'm sure there is a lot of product aspect to this as well, from Greg's standpoint.
Yeah.
How do you see that the product sector grow, or have they started figuring out?
I think that's right. I think you'll start to see the product side piggybacking the consulting services. And maybe you go over the consulting story first, and then you use that to develop products and services, and then you sort of monetize that later on. And that's what a number of companies have started to do. I think in places like Singapore, we've got a number of companies that are doing exactly that. They've really started as consulting offerings, often on the back of like Big Four kind of projects or things like that, where they say, how would I estimate the carbon footprint from a particular retail environment or whatever it is, or how do I optimize the flow of machinery on a port side in Singapore? How do I do that? And then they figure out, well, actually we could actually build a common platform that we could sell to other people, and they're doing that. But they can only do that on the back of real industry experience. It's very difficult to talk about it from a sort of blank slate perspective. You've got to know your industry, because that's the only way you're going to be able to do these operational interventions. It's not a pure reporting problem. It's more complicated than that, because you've got to use the reports to do something, to make a difference.
And I think organizations also need to find a way to incentivize themselves for doing this, because otherwise it becomes a cost for every organization.
Well, that means they need to think in terms of innovation. How do they,
Yes.
how do they pay for it with cost savings or efficiency savings or brand improvements or whatever it is? Absolutely. I think that's right. But that's also the reason to incorporate it into a digital transformation story. Because if you tie one to the other, then digital transformation by its very nature is about a productivity improvement, an innovation improvement. It's not purely an efficiency story. If you view this as a cost issue, you've given up before you start.
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen.
Perfect. Thank you. And I hope you'll share these presentations if you like.
Yeah, I think so. I think I can share some of them, certainly.
Sure.
And I'll do that. Just send it to my email, cmarshall@idc.com. Or I'm not sure, it might even be nasscom.
Probably we'll check and get back on that.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For more interesting content, like, comment and subscribe to our NASSCOM YouTube channel.